moment you say, okay, am I going to go with what culture says, to what Michael brought up earlier? Culture is showing me this, right? My understanding is this, but here's what God has said. Which one of those am I going to do? Go ahead, Ron. They're connected, but they're not identical, right? Part of discipline can be punishment, but when we think of discipline, all we think of is punishment usually. But there's teaching and instruction that go along with discipline as well. And that's where even as you think about parenting as one illustration, when you discipline, right, you're supposed to be teaching. You're supposed to be conveying something, right, that they're learning, not just punishment. And so, again, why is that true? Well, it's because you're doing that because you love. And God is basically saying the same thing here. Yeah. Over and over and over and over again, and it eventually sticks. A couple of things, and then we'll move into the next section so we don't run out of time. As we think about this idea of trusting in God and leaning not on our own understanding, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one is that God does know best. We brought that up. Dave brought that up at the beginning. God's way is the best. We have to remember that because we tend to think our way is the best way. So we've got to keep that in mind. And then all of this is ultimately a life of obedience. That's what it's reflected in, right? To trust in the Lord with all of your heart and to lean not on your own understanding is to obey God in your life, is to choose God's way and not your own. And so it's a very active thing that we're doing. It's not just I sit around all day long and I trust God. It's that I'm living my life trusting Him, doing things His way, seeking things His way, and not just doing whatever I want to do. So notice the next section here, 13 through 20. We're going to circle back around to something we talked about last week. In last chapter 2, he talked about seek for wisdom as it's like silver, search for it as for hidden treasure, right? It's valuable. Notice what he says here to his son again. This is the repetition part that we started off with. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding, for the gain from her is better than the gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding He established the heavens. By His knowledge the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew. So, as we look at this, I want to ask a question, then we'll kind of get into the broader part of this. Think about this here. Why do we tell people that something is valuable over and over and over again? Why do we do that?
Because it's been good to us, and we've been consistent on it, and we just believe on it, so we tell other people.
Okay, so we've seen its value, right? So we tell them that. Think about it from this angle. If you have something valuable in your home, and you happen to let children come into your home, right? What do you tell them? Don't knock it over. Don't touch it, right? And you usually will say why, right? This is my great-great-grandmother's china or whatever it is, right? And so it's really important. It's really valuable. And you typically have to say that maybe a few times, right? Because they're like, well, they don't really think about it. And I think you tell someone something's valuable multiple times because you're fairly certain they've not understood its value yet, right? There are some things where you say, hey, this is a really big deal. And like, okay, yeah, I get it. And you're like, no, I don't think you do get it. It really is important that you understand, don't do that, or make sure to take care of this, or whatever it might be. And so here is Solomon, again, telling his son, and again, if his son is like any other children, I don't know how old he is, but Dad, you already told me this. And he's like, keep listening, right? Don't ignore this. And so he lays out for him the value here of wisdom. So what jumps out to you in this section of 13 through 20 about what he says about the value of wisdom? Michael?
The tree of life was most valuable in the garden.
Yeah, so he takes things that are obviously valuable, right? The tree of life. You think about, what does he say about silver and gold and jewels? What's the illustration? What's the point of using those? What's he say? Better. Right, so much of our we think about investments, right? Like if you were going to buy gold or silver today, it wouldn't be so you can take it down to the store. It'd be so that you can invest it, right? You can hold on to it and hope that it increases. And what Solomon tells his son here is the return of your investment in wisdom is greater than what you would get from silver or from gold. It's more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with it. And so you think about what everyone desires, right? Wealth. Everyone wants to be wealthy and rich and all of that. And if somebody finds out, hey, listen, you can invest in this and you're going to make a huge profit, what do people do? They do that, right? But he says, ultimately, you will get a bigger profit from seeking wisdom than you will ever get from any of those things, right? It's worth the investment to have wisdom. It's valuable. It is necessary for us. What else? Anything else jump out?
It's more peaceful.
Okay, so what we all desire is ultimately what God also desires to give, right? His wisdom leads to a peaceful life, which is the very thing that we want, right? Nobody wants a life that's chaos and issues. It can bring peace, right? He wants to provide the very thing that we want.
Important that he compares that God has the wisdom and that's how he built the world.
Okay.
That is huge.
So you think about sun, wisdom is valuable. It's so valuable God used it to create everything, right? And so he points out a lot of things here. One of the things we talked about, right? Wisdom is more valuable than the valuables that most people are seeking. It's a greater worth than these things. Here's the thing that we have to think about. We can talk all day long about how it's valuable. The question is ultimately, do I believe that it's valuable, right? Do I believe it? And so let me illustrate this. Let me illustrate this. So as my kids get a little bit older, thankfully we're a little ways from this, but as they get a little bit older, we're going to start talking about marriage, right? And things associated with that on, hey, here's what you need to look for in a spouse. And there are certain things, that we're going to say, this is a priority. But if you go back to when you were of, your younger years of maybe dating age of teens and 20s and things like that, I'm sure you probably got advice from different people. And maybe it was really good advice, but what did you probably do to it? You didn't follow it. You're like, oh, but she's pretty. Oh, but listen, there's all these issues, but oh, she's beautiful. You don't understand. You don't understand, right? And the problem is, right, the wisdom that you may have gotten was valuable, but what did you do with it? You ignored it because you thought, going back to our previous section, right, you thought you knew. You thought you understood. And so we can talk all day long and we can walk through all of this and talk about how valuable wisdom is, but the question is not, is wisdom valuable? God's already set that in motion. It's already valuable. The question is, do you think it's valuable? Because if you don't think it's valuable, you're going to treat the china like the kid does. You don't see any worth there. You're going to just discard it because I don't need this. I don't want this. I know better. And so that's the question we have to ask ourselves when we consider wisdom. It's not, is it valuable? Is it worthwhile? Is it good? Do I think God's wisdom is all of that? I think that's the question we have to ask. That's the thing that we have to consider. Any thoughts on the value aspect of wisdom here? Or anything that you've learned about the value of God's wisdom?
It's cool that if we want wisdom, James says we ask God for it.
Okay.
So it is accessible.
Right, so sometimes there are things that are valuable that we desire, but we can't get them, right? I'd love a nice giant ruby. I don't know what I'd do with it, but, it'd be kind of cool to have that, right? I can't do anything with it. I can't get it. That's not going to happen, right? And so there are things that are valuable that we want and we desire, but we can never attain. Or if we were to attain it, it would cost us everything. It wouldn't be worth that. But God says here, this thing is going to get you a better profit than silver and gold. I'll give it to you if you ask for it. And asking shows what? That you understand its value, that you get this is important. Rudy?
I was going to say another reason why people find it difficult to believe it is because if you tell people gold, they can actually see it.
Yeah.
But wisdom, you have to wait until you gain wisdom and then have an outcome. It's like ahead, it's not really there.
Yeah.
You're not visually seeing it. It's more of a spiritual thought.
Well, it's not as tangible, and sometimes it's years before you see the wisdom of a choice that you made, things like that. It doesn't necessarily pop immediately. Michael?
I was just going to make a comment again about long life. And then, I don't understand that from Kent's standpoint,
Right.
But I know that many people who reach his age and everything do talk about how beautiful it is to have had so many years of life. But spiritually speaking, that's what we're all after,
Yeah.
which is eternal life.
Yeah.
And wisdom will get us there.
So here's, how do we know we value it? We live it out, we seek it. And to Michael's point, one of the things that he mentions there, notice down in verse 16. Long life is in her right hand, in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness. He's speaking of wisdom here. And all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. What this made me think about is Solomon himself. And unfortunately, when you think about Solomon, our view of his wisdom is tainted because of the way he didn't use it as he got older. And so we always are like, yeah, but if you go back to the beginning, right, Solomon has that dream where God says, ask me for anything and I'll give it to you, right? And what does Solomon ask for? He asks for wisdom. And God says, because you ask for wisdom and not the lives of your enemies and, riches and all of that, he was going to basically give Solomon all of it, essentially, right? He's going to make him wealthy, even though he didn't ask for wealth. And when you read this, he says, if you want long life, seek wisdom. You want riches and honor, seek wisdom. Now, obviously, that's not the thing that you're seeking. You're seeking the wisdom of God, but the wisdom of God is a blessing, right? And it ultimately can lead to the very same things that people will strive for. But think about it. What good is wealth without wisdom? What good is a long life without wisdom? Right? Much of that's going to be regret. Right? Much of that's going to be used in the wrong way. And so as we think about what God is offering, he's saying you can have a blessed life with wisdom. That it truly is a blessing for us to have it. And then as Rudy pointed out at the very last couple of verses there, he points to the wisdom that God used, that God in his wisdom created. And so again, all of this kind of thinking from the perspective of Solomon to his son, value what I'm telling you. Value the wisdom of God. Keep it in focus. Keep it in mind. Any other thoughts before we go into the next section? All right, so let's go into 21 through 26 here. And this is going to be kind of along the same lines, but it's the blessing of it. He says, my son, do not lose sight of these. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, and they will be life for your soul and adornment for your neck. Then you will walk on your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. If you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden terror or of the ruin of the wicked. When it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your feet from being caught. So, in looking at that, the blessings here of wisdom that he continues with, what jumps out to you? What do we learn here about wisdom?
Besides wisdom, I mean, you can know what to do right,
Sure.
but you don't always do it.
Sure.
So this is saying,
Do it. Yeah, notice the beginning, right? Do not lose sight of these. Always have them in focus. And oftentimes, as we think back to the decisions that we make that were poor, right? You can probably say, yeah, I wasn't really thinking about that stuff. Right? I didn't sit there and have God's wisdom in my mind and make the wrong choice. It was probably because I didn't have it anywhere in the same zip code that I was. And I just reacted, right? I just did whatever I wanted to do. Go ahead, Michael.
It seems to say that, if we choose wisdom, if we put it into practice in our lives, we're likely not to choose a lifestyle where we're constantly inviting trouble. Trouble is following us around without constantly having to look over our shoulders. Just practically, you can just be in a troublesome culture and environment because of not being wise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dana was saying you can live a more comfortable life.
Yeah, notice the language that's used here down in verses 23 and 24. Then you will walk on your way securely and your foot will not stumble. If you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. There's a peace that comes with the way of life that God describes here. As we think about this, he says, do not lose sight of sound wisdom and discernment. And obviously, this goes back to the beginning of the lesson. What is so often easy for us to do is to lose sight. It's to lose sight of what we should be thinking about, the way we should be focusing on things, what God is concerned about, and to just do whatever we want. But he says, keep these things in focus. Let these things be kind of in your eyesight all the time. Walk with them, go with them wherever you go. And then he lays out that ultimately these are going to lead to true blessings. You go back through those verses there, starting in verse 23, and you've got the things that we want. You've got security, you've got peace, you've got, and this last one I think is very relatable. Verse 25, do not be afraid of sudden terror, do not be afraid of sudden terror, or of the ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. We don't have to be worried about events that are unfolding around us, right? Because we've got to trust in God. It is a true blessing for us. And ultimately, and this is something we'll circle back around to in this series, is when we talk about the wisdom of God, it is life-changing. It's supposed to be life-changing. And we've talked about this before, but as Christians, our lives should look different, right? Different from what they were before, but also different than the world. And it's not that people in the world can't live wisely in certain capacities. It's not that people can't figure things out in some capacity, that there are lots of people who, they learn some really good things and they live life wisely in certain ways. Again, you read through the Proverbs and you can look at all over the place that people have learned these things. They've learned some of these different aspects of, hey, this is how life works, right? But for us, we need to recognize that our life is truly meant to be different, that the wisdom of God should change how we interact with this world. And it should be a blessing to us ultimately to do this. But notice the end of the verse there, verse 26. For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. What does this all circle back to? To God, right? And I think, yeah, God is the power behind all of this. And I think one of the challenges for us is the wiser we grow, what are we more tempted to do? You get wiser, and if it goes a little bit off, what does that wisdom maybe turn into? Pride, right? All of a sudden, I'm wise, right? I've figured things out. I'm one of those people who understands everything, right? And you've talked to people like that where they know it, right? They've got it all figured out. And ultimately, as we go through and we look at the wisdom of Proverbs, we should be wise and we should grow in wisdom, but it all still points back to God, right? That He is the one who provides the wisdom, as we saw last week from chapter 2 down in verse 6. For the Lord gives wisdom, from His mouth come knowledge and understanding. Why are you wise? God, right? That's why you're wise. And so we don't get too big. I keep thinking of weird phrases that I grew up with. Too big for your britches we don't say britches anymore, though. Some of you guys probably still think that way. It's a dated phrase, but I wasn't going to say that, but you could say it. But right, sometimes we do that, right? We allow this wisdom that we've gained to become the thing that's the I am wise, when ultimately I'm still needing to learn, right? There's still room to grow. I'm still able to get wiser as I live for the Lord. And so let's get to the last section here, and then we'll wrap things up. Verses 27 through 35. This is going to relate to relationships. And so he says this, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come again, tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you. Do not plan evil against your neighbor, who dwells trustingly beside you. Do not contend with a man for no reason, when he has done you no harm. Do not envy a man of violence, and do not choose any of his ways. For the devious person is an abomination to the Lord, but the upright are in His confidence. The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but He blesses the dwelling of the righteous. Toward the scorners He is scornful, but to the humble He gives favor. The wise will inherit honor, but fools get disgrace. And actually, I had that up on the screen that I already finished it, so we didn't have that up there. So sorry for that. But what do you notice from those words here? What's he talking about?
He pays to be wise.
Okay, it's good, right? It's good to be wise. God blesses that. Okay, so this is all relationship oriented, and then when you keep walking through Proverbs, you're going to see that God's wisdom is not just about your relationship with God. Much of it deals with your relationship with people, that God's wisdom not only blesses our walk with Him, but it blesses our walk with others. It's beneficial, and He focuses in initially, right, on your neighbor. And He says several things about the neighbor here. He says, do good when you can, provide for him when you are able, don't plot against him, don't create a fight, don't pick a fight, right? These kinds of things. Now, if we did that, imagine a community, right, where people were doing that, what would that community look like? It'd be very nice, right? You wouldn't need very many police officers at that point because people would be caring for one another. Now, what's the problem? We're not in that world, right? We're not there. And this is where I think sometimes, and I think we may mentioned this recently, but there are times where the things that God has called us to can seem like they don't work, right? You say, well, this is not the real world. This doesn't work that way. But the issue is not what God has said. Right? The issue is not what, this is what is right, and this is what works. The problem is we've not implemented it, right? The problem is not, man, we cannot, there's just no way to live good in this world. There's just so many evil things, and the world is like this, and there can't be a God because of all of this. But is that because we've tried what God said to do and it failed, and we're here? Or because we actually did do what God said to do, and that's why we're here? What's the second one, right? We didn't do this. The reason the world is the way it is not because we followed God's instructions, and that's where it led us to. The reason we're in the mess that we're in is because we didn't do what he said, and this is what he said it would lead to. And so you go through the Israelites are an example. When the Israelites did what God told them to do and what he said, if you'll do this, then I'll provide this, what happened? Exactly what God said. But when God said, if you're going to do this and you're going to go after idols and you're going to do this and treat people this way, then what's going to happen? Punishment. And what did God do? He punished, right? And so the issue is not, man, God, we've done all that you've said, and it doesn't work. No, it works. If we would do this, it works. We just don't, we as a people don't do it. Nancy?
The cool thing is, we can get close to this, and we do in the church.
And we're supposed to.
That is something that we can offer to the world.
Yeah.
Is that community that we have, and that's really a gift.
Yeah, we're supposed to be different enough that our way of life hopefully sparks in people, like maybe there's something bigger than just what I've seen in my world around me. Maybe there is something that's good out there. They should see that in us, right? They should see that, wait a second, these people, they get along. They like each other, right? They're there for one another, right? Those are the things that they should see. And we see that in our culture, right? Family will do that for each other. Sometimes friends will do that. But here's the thing. Many of us haven't known each other for very long, right? It's not like we're talking decades of experience with one another, and yet, what do we do for each other? We're there. We support. We help, right? We're different. We don't come from the same family. Most of us aren't from the same places, right? We have so few connections, and yet we have the one that matters the most, which is Christ. And that way of life, this way of loving your neighbor, right, should be different and should show the world, hey, maybe there is something to this whole Jesus thing. What does he say then? He says something interesting after this. So he tells us to treat our neighbors the right way. Then he says, do not envy a man of violence and do not choose any of his ways. Why would he have to say that? Why would Solomon tell his son, don't envy the wicked?
Yeah, because it's so easy to beat up on someone who's wronged you. Look, it feels good, looks like it's easy.
So there are times, and we don't need examples tonight, but there are times where you've let loose, right? You've just let it rip on somebody, and you've unloaded, right? You've blasted them for all that you're worth because of what they've done, what they've said, whatever it is, and there's a little bit of satisfaction in that for a little bit, right? Man, I feel better now. And I think there are times where we look at the world and we look at those who are wicked in the world and we see they get things done, right? They take something that they want. They handle things, right? And there can be envy of, man, our way seems kind of slow. Doesn't always work, right? That it's possible to envy those who do things the wrong way because maybe it looks kind of good because of the end result, which we talked about earlier. Sometimes the result can skew our perception of what we ought to do. Good reading.
The main reason is because God despises wickedness.
Yeah, we don't want to do that because God says, I despise this, right? We don't want to choose this way. We don't want to envy this because God says that's an abomination to me. That way of life is the exact opposite of what I want. So don't envy that. Don't look at it and say, man, kind of would like that. Don't do that. Don't look at that. And again, you think about the call to love your enemy, right? There's a temptation to, but man, those people who get back at their enemies, that probably feels pretty good, right? And God says, don't go down that road. That's not what is good for you. It's not what you ought to do. And so he ultimately ends with this. Toward the scorners he is scornful, but to the humble he gives favor. The wise will inherit honor, but fools get disgrace. And so God's way is the best way. I want to end with just a couple of kind of takeaways here. A few things to think about, and if you've got any other thoughts. I know we went through that fast, but I wanted to get through everything. Number one is this. Wisdom must be intentionally focused on. I think we talked about this recently. You know, we don't get it doesn't get downloaded into us. We don't sit there and God hooks up something and we just get it all downloaded and we're wise, right? You've got to choose wisdom. And then you have to remember the wisdom that you have chosen to learn. And that's what Solomon's telling his son. I'm imparting wisdom to you. Don't forget it. Don't leave it alone. Intentionally remember it. And for us, that's going to mean repetition, right? That's going to mean having these things come up over and over and over again. Now, what's the problem? Right? You show up on a Sunday, and I preach a lesson that you've heard this passage who knows how many times before. What do you tend to do?
Not listen.
Not listen, right? Because like, oh, I know all this. I've heard it before, right? And if you raised kids at some point, you know that glazed look comes over their face when you start having that. Now, son, don't do, and it's the glazed look. I know what you're going to say, Dad. And the problem is they're not listening, right? And we're not listening. And so one of the challenges for us is the repetition side of things. We just think, well, I got this, right? I've got it. But we need it again and again and again. We need it more than we think we need it, right? We need to embed it within us, and that means repetition over and over and over again. The wisdom of God needs to be a part of our thinking.
You know, as you get older, you live life, you learn things, and you think, oh, he really did know what he was talking about.
Yeah.
I think we can do it this way.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just gotta make mistakes.
Yeah. Sometimes repetition needs a little help. It needs a little stubbornness from us because we need to go through the experience. And sometimes, unfortunately, the repetition is us doing the same thing over and over again before we realize, oh, this is not smart, right? But sometimes the unfortunate truth is we don't listen to God's wisdom until it slaps us in the face. I think we talked about that last week. Sometimes we have to experience the consequences before we realize, oh, wait, he was right. Go ahead, Dave.
Think of how much Psalms is a reminder of the events that they encountered, like the sea and the Mount Sinai. There's all that reminding all the time in the Psalms.
Yeah, it's the same accounts, right, of the history of God's people over and over and over again. And you think about even, the Lord's Supper and all of these various things that we do all the time, over and over and over again. Is the point so that we can just kind of make it so that it becomes routine? Well, of course not. The point is that in doing it over and over and over again, it's embedded within us. Right? It's supposed to continue to matter, and we don't forget it. And that's what this wisdom is supposed to be for us. And so we need to be intentional in how we focus on wisdom. Number two, Dave started us off this way. God's way is the best way. That we have to remember that. We've got to remember that because if we don't think God's way is the best way, we will choose a different way. Right? If you think there's a better way to do something, you're going to do it. And we've all done that before in other areas of life where you talk to an expert, right? You have someone come to your house and they're going to repair something and they tell you what needs to be done and you're like, no. I know a different way, right? I know you're the expert. I know you've been doing this for 25 years. I've Googled something. I can do this, right? And the truth is, when we do that, every once in a while, we get it right just enough that it makes us keep doing it. But with God, if we think God's way is not the best way, we're not going to listen to it. We're going to do what we want. And so we have to start off with that base point. And here's the problem. Recognizing God's way as the best way may not always make sense to you. You may look at it and say, but God, that doesn't work. That doesn't make sense. I don't want to do that. And so if you don't start from the beginning with God's way is best, you'll talk yourself out of it. Right? You'll convince yourself that it's not. You have to start off with, and this is, there's so many things like this where if you know this truth and you hold on to that, you can stand firm, right? You can keep going the direction that you need to. But if you start off and you're like, well, I don't know. Maybe he's not right on this. Well, you've already lost at that point. You're probably going to give in to whatever it is that you want to do. And then the last one is this. It needs to permeate our entire lives. Right? Wisdom should go with us wherever we go. At home, we live wisely. At work, we live wisely. In the church, we live wisely. When we're out and about, we live wisely. Right? Wisdom goes with us wherever we go and all of the things associated with it. They walk with us wherever we go. We seek to be wise continually. That's God's desire for us. And ultimately, God's way, it truly is best. And we see this throughout Scripture. We see this even in the embodiment of imitating Jesus, which we talked about last week. To have the mind of Christ. It is the best way. It is the best way. We have to remember that. We have to seek that and keep that in focus. Any closing comments on Proverbs 3? All right, so next week is chapter 4, and so we will dig in to that together. I think that one is slightly shorter, but we will talk a little bit more about wisdom and go from there. So let's pray, and then we'll be done. Father, we're thankful for the wisdom that you've given us, grateful for what you share, and I pray that we would take it to heart, that we would be mindful of all that you've taught. And we ask that we would have a desire and a passion to hear it over and over and over again, that we would have it embedded within our thinking, so that when we act, when we go out into the world, it is what we think about and what we do. Bless us, Father, with the wisdom that we need. Help us to be a people who are living wisely for you. We thank you for Jesus and the example that he set for us. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.